With regards to broadband connectivity, I'm more appreciative of the road crews trenching fiber optic cable along our nearby county highway. I think about my grown children's high-speed internet connections that enable them to work from home and communicate in real time with colleagues across town and around the world. And how can children possibly keep up in school these days without reliable high-speed internet? At this very moment, I'm reminded how rapid and reliable internet connections enable speakers and audience members to join this Zoom meeting and hopefully not get dropped along the way. I noticed the big dead pine tree that is at risk of blowing down and cutting off electricity to our entire neighborhood. I realize we'd be in a real pickle if natural gas ceased to flow to our furnace boiler. Today's webinar and the others in this series certainly heighten our awareness of our critical infrastructure. Today's speakers are qualified by the fact that they work professionally day to day on the design, construction, and function of our communication and energy infrastructure. Of particular interest to League members, today's speakers will offer concrete, well-substantiated advice about how we can advocate for ongoing maintenance and key improvements to our broadband and energy infrastructure. We thank them in advance, and especially for their taking on the task of explaining things to us members of the voting public. Our speakers are Vik Verma, Greg Schroeder, Alyssa Kenny, Greg Levesque, and Dan Kreuger. They will do self-introductions in turn. So let's begin. Vik Verma, please.
Thank you, Dorothy. Let me go ahead and share my presentation. Let's see here. Everyone see my presentation? Great. Thank you, Dorothy. My name is Vik Verma. I wrote the broadband chapter for our 2024 Wisconsin Infrastructure Report Card. In my day job, I work as a structural engineer with Bassett Mechanical here in Kaukauna, Wisconsin. So I'll go ahead and get started with our introduction briefly. Broadband infrastructure is an essential element of our economy and daily life. It allows us to be connected. As it continues to grow, engineers of all types are playing an increased role. When we think about infrastructure, we haven't traditionally thought about broadband, but broadband is infrastructure. It allows us to function. Our communications are dependent on that. And that's illustrated by the significant funding for broadband in the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed at the federal level. To give you a brief journey, there was discussion at the global level of ASCE to do broadband as early as 2020, as early as 2013. There was discussion for those two report cards as broadband became more important in our society. We did not do anything on those report cards at the global level or national level, but it had been talked about. As we moved into 2021, there was more interest in broadband. There was more urgency in particular because we were coming out of the pandemic, and for those of us who worked at home and were working at home all the time, connectivity was vital, and it was also vital for our kids in our schools. And so there wasn't a full chapter, but there was a short ungraded spotlight brief in the 2021 ASCE national or global report card. Challenges in terms of doing the report card were lack of dedicated experts on trying to get that information, and at the national level, minimal public data. ASCE has wanted to continue forward, and so this past year, for the first time, a state report card has been included in a chapter on broadband. We are the first state, Wisconsin, to do one anywhere in the country. So we're kind of, I guess, a trailblazer of sorts. And so we did a full report card with a grade based on the 8 standard key criteria provided by ASCE. So broadband, where are we and where do we want to go? So some definitions. The FCC defines advanced telecommunications capability as defined as following. 25 megabits per second download speed and 3 megabits upload speed. So we'll call that 25-3. But there's a goal to have faster speeds than that. And you can see below that's 100 megabits and 20 megabits download and upload respectively. So I think that's what we're looking at going towards. So our key priority is to achieve faster speeds. To achieve this, we're looking at having more fiber and cable installations as much as possible. They are a priority, and in addition, there's an emphasis to go from 25/3 to 100/20, and so that's what we're looking at as we move forward. So the current state of broadband, and I do want to thank Alyssa for the information that we received. Nationwide information isn't always easy to get, but in Wisconsin, we were able to get that, and that was a huge help. So thank you, Alyssa, for that. You can see here, I put this into a table form. We are trying to get to where where that 80% served locations at 100/20 gets closer to 100%, and we're still only at about 80% of the served locations. And unserved and no service, we're looking at, we're still pretty high. We're about 10%. So about 10% aren't even meeting, 10 to 11% are not meeting the 25/3 rating. And so we're trying to make sure that we're improving that. And then you can see this in terms of the numbers, in terms of, that was by percentage here. You can see the raw numbers. We have about 2.3 million locations in the state that are considered locations for broadband, and about 25,000 don't have any service, and about 221,000 do not have any service. And we're still at about 218,000 that are at the 25/3. So to summarize what I just said, significant number of underserved and unserved locations remain. There are limitations to broadband access and high speeds, and lower speeds, there's the consequence are speed, but also reliability. A lot of times you're needing internet and you're not having that. And examples are schools, video functions may be hampered or non-existent, and a prime example is telehealth. Telehealth became very important during the pandemic and is still very important for those who live in, say, northern Wisconsin, where physicians and medical services are not readily available in person. And so with that in mind, I used to live in Merrill, Wisconsin, just not quite northern Wisconsin, but kind of on the way there. And broadband was a significant issue in the area. So as far as current and recent broadband investments, since 2014, the Wisconsin Broadband Office has distributed $319 million in grants for the deployment of broadband infrastructure. That constitutes 458 projects and has supported or enhanced services to about 450,000 homes. And so that's, and so we'll go through, there's several other, and I'll go through each of these funding sources briefly. There's the State Broadband Expansion Grant Program, the ARPA Broadband Grant Access Program through the ARPA, which was passed in 2021, the CARES Broadband Access Grant Program, capital projects, other broadband investments, and then finally the bipartisan infrastructure law. The state broadband expansion grant program is a law. It's Wisconsin Statute 196.504. Grants that it's for grants that support the construction of broadband infrastructure in areas where broadband service is underserved or unserved. So you can see there are about $214 million in grants, and about 363 grants have been awarded since 2014. Next, the ARPA broadband grants. That's very recent, 2021. There were grants as part of ARPA as we were coming out of the pandemic to build fiber capacity in underserved areas of the state. This is done nationwide, but we also had that specifically here in Wisconsin. We got $100 million in grants in 2021, and 83 grants were awarded at that time. That was money that came out very quickly as we were trying to rebuild our economy quickly. The CARES Broadband Access Program, another program where it's a smaller program, but grants were awarded to build fiber and fixed wireless capacity in underserved areas of the state. This was in 2020, and there were 12 grants of about a little over $5 million. Capital Projects Broadband Access Grant Programs. This is for the purpose of upgrading to 100/20. Priorities are for these grants are affordability and investment in communities that have been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And $42 million on a competitive basis have been awarded through the spring of last year. There are other broadband investments. There are too many to mention. There are a lot of them. They address multiple aspects of broadband development, including infrastructure development, connectivity of households, service improvements for federally recognized tribes, rural broadband access, and educational broadband access. As far as our future need, in terms of universal service, and of course, I didn't have it on the slide, but the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which we will talk about in a minute. Our goal is universal service, that everyone has 100/20 internet speeds by the year 2030 in approximately 5 years. Right now, we're looking at about 464,000 underserved and unserved locations. The cost to get to universal service is $2.2 billion per the Wisconsin Broadband Office. So that's the total cost we have. The bipartisan infrastructure law can be part of that solution. There's $65 billion in funding nationwide to ensure that all Americans have access to affordable and reliable broadband service. As part of the BIL Broadband Equity Access, the BEAD program with broadband will provide broadband funding to the state of Wisconsin. Also, infrastructures and planning, infrastructure deployment, and adoption programs. With respect to operational management, maintenance, there are challenges in rural expansion, adequate maintenance of the system, geographical and topography, smaller subscriber bases. If we're not having as many subscribers, there's not as much money coming in to maintain systems. It's important to ensure that there is adequate funding for operations and maintenance, particularly in rural areas, to ensure the development of increased broadband capacity in Wisconsin. That's true in the same way it is for, say, roads. The effects of unserved. So we'll look at public safety. Broadband is a public safety issue. We don't often think about that directly, but it is. Limited or delayed emergency response. If there's an emergency and you can't get through, time matters. And disaster response. You see disasters such as the fires in California. If our broadband communications are unable to handle the high volume, then we're going to have even bigger problems. So we need to have good broadband. Resilience. Resilience is the ability to respond. Resilience equals reliability of service. Service gaps related to broadband can be problematic during extreme weather conditions and emergencies. So, and also business activities. If business activities are affected, companies lose money and our economy doesn't do as well. So finding new ways to improve broadband infrastructure. Innovation has been at the core of broadband development. Today, there are more advanced technologies, fiber, cable, DSL, and satellite. The emphasis is on improving the accessibility of fiber broadband access. Challenges do lie in full implementation. Technology has improved significantly, and we should have further improvements are anticipated. So I'll go through the grade. And again, we're on our first report card, so I think that's important to note as we look at the grade. We gave the grade an overall C-. And so here's some, and we'll look at the 8 criteria. So some areas where we may be lacking. Only 2% of satellite providers deliver broadband speed across all locations. Greater coverage from greater coverage from satellite providers would reduce gaps. So if you look back, there's very small. Satellite is pretty small, and that would help us out quite a bit. About 1/3 of school districts report that at least 1/4 of their students do not have enough internet access at home to complete homework assignments and school-related activities. So this is an issue. It's, you know, as we promote education, broadband is integral to that. And so the state broadband office does collect deployment data by technology, method, and speed, but we do not have public data on the condition of telecom networks, and condition is important to know. Funding. Wisconsin is one of the few states to have established a statewide broadband office and invest state money. As you can see from the previous slides, there's a lot of grants and money that have gone out, which is good. We have also earned $179 million from the FCC's Rural Deployment Opportunity Fund and another $142 million from the Affordable Connectivity Program, which Congress hasn't funded since 2024. So we are dependent on federal dollars, so that impacts our grade here as well. Operations and maintenance. As we talked about before, challenges we have that need to be addressed are performing proactive maintenance and upgrades to existing broadband infrastructure, because it's difficult in some areas because of topography and limited ratepayer bases to fund these operating expenses. And for the same reasons that it may not make financial sense for companies to build out networks, it's also difficult to fund and staff operations for maintenance. So we have to build it out, but we also have to have money for operations and maintenance, which is key to continue to go forward. Future need. So as we talked about, we want to be at 100/20 by 2030. The recent federal money can help, but those speeds are, you know, it's also the truth that things move forward, and those speeds may not be enough to meet the needs of residents when we get to 2030. So we're trying to anticipate future need of where technology will go and what we need to address. As we talked about before, there's a $2.2 billion cost to meet this. Right now, only $1 billion is coming from the BEAD federal award. So we anticipate there will be a funding gap to meet this. And so we need to address that. Public safety, resilience, and innovation. You know, we are depending more and more. Better performing broadband is critical to making sure our disaster response and medical services and school instruction are adequate. It matters to all. There's so many parts of our life that need to that broadband factors into, and so we have been innovative in funding the supply side with subscriber subsidies, but the supply side, as we talked about before, satellite ISPs have not delivered broadband speeds at the benchmark we need at 100/20. So to conclude with some conclusions, state of Wisconsin will require $2.2 billion in funding to achieve the goals of the 5-year statewide plan. Funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law is a key to making this reality. Additional state funding will be an essential element of the funding needed to for the 5-year statewide plan. So as we head into the budget season, as we are well underway in the Wisconsin legislature, that's something when you're talking to the legislators to talk to them about, to have more money for that purpose. Then finally, increasing the availability of high-speed broadband access. We know that's the core goal, and increased funding will help make that a reality, as I just talked about. And I'll take questions at the end, and that is my presentation.
Thank you, Vik, for that clear and concise presentation of the report card. And I just want to remind everybody, please put questions in the chat as they come to mind. We'll let you raise your hands at the end too, but better to write those questions in the chat while they're at the top of your mind. Our next speaker is Alyssa Kenny. And Alyssa, once again, I'll let you do your introduction and proceed.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Kenny. I'm the State Director for Broadband and Digital Equity. I work at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. And I'm really excited that you put broadband in your report card and that Wisconsin is leading there. We have one of the first state broadband offices in the country, and it's nice to know we're leading on this report card. And so I'm going to share my presentation. I will let the cat out of the bag and say that our office was the source for a lot of data in the report card. So you'll see some of the same numbers and some slightly updated. Let me do that. All right. But maybe one of the first things I want to say is I work at the Public Service Commission, but in the state of Wisconsin and largely across the nation, broadband is an infrastructure, but it is not a utility. So it is not regulated. The Public Service Commission doesn't control where broadband is constructed. We don't require any particular pricing. As was mentioned earlier, we don't require certain maintenance. So across the country, broadband is considered an information service, not a communication service. And so that in some ways limits the opportunity for government to make sure that everybody has broadband. And so one of the strategies in the state of Wisconsin is using grants to sort of fit those gaps where the regular market doesn't make broadband available to the public, because we do see it as essential. It is important for school, for health, for work, for participating in government, for cat videos, for all the things. We see it as critical, but it isn't regulated. So our vision and our mission at the office is really that all Wisconsinites have access to broadband that's affordable and that everybody is sort of equitably sharing in those benefits. So all the ways that broadband access makes you save time, makes it easier to, make doctor's appointments, see your physician, access school, access virtual work, access resources and information about your community. We want to make sure that everyone in the state has both the physical infrastructure and the access to that. We used to talk about this quite a bit as kind of 3 A's. The first A being access, so that's the physical infrastructure. What we heard, and I think what you saw in Vic's presentation was a little bit, some people, it's certainly not the case that 1/3 of school children in the state don't have access to the physical infrastructure, but it is the case that a number of school kids across the state can't afford it. So that it's not, so affordability is really key with broadband. If people have access but they can't afford it, it is frequently one of those critical services that people go without. So you need the access. You need to have as many levers as you can to make sure people have affordability so that people can actually subscribe to the service that's available to them. You need to make sure people have the resources to adopt the service and really make full use of it. So if they are subscribing to it, they can take advantage of telehealth, or they can take advantage of streaming services or information. One of the things that has really come up for us as a state as we've been preparing for this bipartisan infrastructure law is a lot of the state has inadequate broadband. And so there's people who have kind of just barely enough, or it's available, but it's very expensive, or it's available unless the pine trees have a lot of snow on them. And so adequacy has been another strong issue. So it can't just be that sort of minimum advertised speed. It has to really be resilient. It has to be reliable. It has to, work as promised 99.9% of the time. Unlike other areas of the Public Service Commission, we don't reach our broadband goals in the state through regulation. We reach it through data, through administering grant funds, through strategic partners, and through thinking about that digital opportunity, or that like affordability and adoption. So for other parts of the state infrastructure, the Public Service Commission has some different regulatory and policy levers. Our broadband office has grants. I'm super excited that the table that was shared in the previous presentation and my table actually match in numbers. So I was looking quickly, but you will see I also have a 2.3 million 161 locations in the state in my table. So I won't go through the table because you just saw that, but I will just quickly talk about the different types of technology that can deliver internet service. The one we hear about the most or frequently now is fiber. And fiber is strands of glass. And so internet is traveling in fiber at the speed of light. So that's why it's faster. There's also cable, DSL, and copper. Those are also wires. And in the state of Wisconsin, most of our wires are buried. Some of them are aerial. But in those types of wires, the internet's traveling at the speed of sound. So that's where you get some of that slower service. We also have fixed wireless in the state. And some people think of this as kind of very similar to what they would get on their cell phone. It is actually different. There is a tower somewhere near your home, and you have basically a base station, a receiver radio that's fixed in your home, and that tower has a consistent signal between your house, that base station in your house, and that tower. We used to think of fixed wireless as needing a line of sight to really be effective. Technology continues to improve, and there's certainly a number of fixed wireless pieces of equipment and radios that now can sort of send a signal when they don't have line of sight. But generally, when we think of that technology, we think of people as needing a line of sight or a relatively unobstructed line of sight to the tower most of the time. And then we have satellite service. We talked about this a little bit before, but I will say satellite service is now kind of divided up into two buckets. We have the low Earth orbit satellite, and that's when you think of a service like Starlink. And so those are thousands and thousands of very small satellites that are, I just put my note, they're 266 kilometers above the Earth. And that's a low Earth orbit satellite. And then there's the high Earth orbit satellite. So that's like a Viasat or a HughesNet. And those are over 2,000 kilometers above the Earth. And those are geosynchronous. They turn at the same rate that the Earth's turning. So you sort of connect to one satellite and it turns as you turn. So those are kind of the different technologies that broadband is getting delivered to people in the state of Wisconsin. We talked, Vik really nicely laid out kind of all of the grants that we've already given out. And over here where you see this draft stamp, that's a map of all the funding that's currently deployed in the state. And so there are a lot of active and in progress grants. It's sort of a tremendous amount of in progress, and you can see kind of based on technology, the map looks different, right? So a fiber project tends to be small and looks like a little wiggly worm or something, and a fixed wireless looks generally like a tower with a circle around it. And so those are the projects that the state has either in progress or has been recently finished. And then the other map, the one with the gray or the dark gray background, this is just what we do when we get grant applications. We have to both evaluate them against the current need, but we also evaluate them against everything that's in progress in our office. And so just kind of a little peek into sort of behind the scenes at what happens when we review grant applications. So every time a grant application comes in, we're basically doing geospatial mapping and looking how it fits with other investments. You saw something similar to this, but one of the things that's happening in the state is we have this BEAD program. So this is part of that bipartisan infrastructure law. So we're very much focused on how many locations in the state are eligible for this very specific pot of federal funding called BEAD. And so this is just a sort of differently done graph. You see most of the cable and the fiber in the state is that purple, which we would consider served. So those people as having sufficient, they have access to a reliable high-speed internet. And then you have kind of the red, where there are people in the state who really have what we call no service. So that means they only have access to satellite, or there's still about 8,000 people in our state who have dial-up service. And then you have the underserved and the unserved, and Vik talked about those two categories. But basically that red, orange, and blue is where we want to be investing additional public dollars to make sure that we get everybody in the state service. We also in our state have, like I showed you on that map, we have 175,000 locations that are under construction right now. We've had, you know, the governor's office and the legislature has continued to sort of give our state grant program money and then allocate federal funds to the deployment of broadband. And that's helped us make a lot of progress and really put a very significant dent. I thought people might sort of appreciate this. We talked about that $2.2 billion number. That $2.2 billion is not distributed equally by location. And so you have some locations sort of down here, like that have a very low CapEx. Maybe we just need $800 of federal public funds. And then you have locations way at what we call the end of the hockey stick, where you're talking about basically $300 million to fund sort of like the last 1.5%. And so it gets extremely costly as you get to sort of the most remote areas. And as we're working on broadband deployment in the state, we are really at that getting very expensive. Like we're kind of at the locations that the market has not served. But there are still locations, if you look at this chart, that maybe the marketplace with just a little bit of public dollars could cover. I did want to just mention, because broadband is unregulated, the cost to build does not equal the will to build. So just because there's dollars available does not necessarily mean there is a business or an internet service provider willing and wanting to build locations there. And there's no regulation to compel them. There's just grant dollars to entice them. So what you would see in typical broadband deployment, so sort of private investment without those public dollars, is you would see a situation where the cost to build are lower than the revenue that's anticipated over time. And what we have in the state of Wisconsin, particularly where you get to some of our cranberry bogs and our granite peaks and our driftless area of the state and our very sparse, gorgeous north woods with those pine trees with snow, is you have a situation where the cost to build exceeds the revenue expected over time. And so I'll just sort of wrap up very quickly, but what you want to do is you want our office not to fund the entire project, because broadband is a revenue generating business in the state of Wisconsin. You want to ensure that we're putting the right amount of public dollars in, and that public dollars is what we might call getting those projects to commercial viability or getting sort of the right return on investment. So the state doesn't necessarily need to pay for all construction everywhere needed. These are private businesses that have a revenue generating opportunity. You want to have the state put dollars in where they're most needed to get that reasonable return on investment and entice businesses to getting us to universal service. And so you want to really think about both the engineering, but also the economics of how you use public dollars in a prudent and an efficient way to get service to the people who need it the most. It's an exciting time in our office. On January 13th, we opened up our largest grant round in the history of our office and our commission, over $1 billion for the BEAD program. We are currently accepting applications and trying to deploy these federal funds per kind of the statute in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So we're excited to be doing that, and I'm very excited to be here. I have some resources, mostly just so if people go to our slides, they can click on links. I will pass it, but thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Alyssa, for that well-articulated explanation of the state's role in broadband connectivity through wires and fibers in the ground, or signals transmitted from towers or satellites. And I particularly appreciate your acknowledging the needs of the sparsely populated areas in the Northwoods where I live. So on to Greg Schroeder.
And for everyone to know, Greg unfortunately could not be here today live, but he did record his presentation for us. He is one of the Energy Chapter authors, and we will be playing his presentation for you.
Okay, I'm Greg Schroeder, and I was the lead author of the Energy Chapter. I'm an ASCE Life member and retired gas engineer from WI Energies. Next slide. We're going to get off to a quick start here with this photo of the liquefied natural gas plant in Ixonia, Wisconsin. This is one of 2 new LNG plants and shows that energy infrastructure in Wisconsin is in a period of rapid change. I could have represented the rapid change by a photo of a new Wisconsin wind farm or a Wisconsin solar farm or a Wisconsin electric vehicle charging station. Maybe a few of you have drove your Tesla to work today. Next slide. Another surprising sign of rapid change is the announcement of a new artificial intelligence data center in Port Washington. This one will be in addition to the Microsoft data center in Mount Pleasant. These large demand increases were not even contemplated a short while ago. Besides these rapid changes for both the supply and demand of energy in Wisconsin, we have experienced a change of presidents this week. What will change with Trump? Federal incentives for renewables may change rapidly, while other trends will not. The slogan to drill, baby, drill just won't happen until oil and gas prices rise above their already low levels. I also predict that there will be no sudden reversal by utilities in Wisconsin to back off from commitments to net zero carbon. More about that later. Next. I'd like to thank and recognize the members of my team for their work on the Energy Chapter. Bruce Ramey is a retired power plant manager and former vice president for the environment at WI Energies. Bill Krall is a gas engineer with extensive experience in large-scale generation plant design and construction. I'd also like to thank the national experts from ASCE for their input. Next. As was done for other infrastructure categories, energy was rated on these 8 criteria. Wisconsin's energy infrastructure is rated a C+ in the 2024 report. This is a drop from the previous grade of B. Overall, the decline can be attributed to risks associated with rapid change, increasing demand, and reduced reliability as measured by objective criteria. It's interesting that spending more money is not the solution to raising the grade for energy infrastructure. Of course, it won't hurt. Currently, capacity is the most important criteria. We will spend the most time on energy capacity. Keep in mind that this will refer most importantly to both power generation and transmission lines, and not as much to local distribution wires. Next slide. These pie charts contrast the capacity or capability to generate electricity on the left with the usage from various sources with the actual percentage of electricity generated over a 1-year period. This gets at the importance of the availability of a generation source, as well as the ability to ramp output up quickly. So while percentages of actual generation by renewals have increased, we still are highly dependent on nuclear, coal, and gas to meet the requirements of our peak energy demands. This will continue to be the case until we find options for large-scale energy storage. Unfortunately, I don't think we even know what those solutions will be yet. Next slide. This table contains a great deal of critical information. It shows the transition of energy generation from 2015 to 2020. If we had the 2025 data, it would show a continuation of the rapid change from coal to natural gas and renewables. Although renewables are growing, we again see that they are still a small percentage of necessary capacity. Nuclear is unchanged, and since it is the only base load that is not a fossil fuel, it is incredibly important to reliability as well as decarbonization. The only active nuclear plant in Wisconsin is the Point Beach plant. It is critical that this plant continue to operate. We should also be planning for the future of nuclear generation for our state, whether it would be modernizing Point Beach and Kewaunee or adding small-scale nuclear reactors. Where are our champions for nuclear? Will they come from Madison, from the PSC media, or the public? I think the need is urgent. Now back to fossil fuel trends. We're rapidly replacing coal generation with natural gas. This is problematic. First, because we are becoming overly dependent on natural gas, and secondly, because it is a short-term solution if our ultimate goal is to eliminate all fossil fuel. For my entire career, utility leadership has embraced the importance of diversity of generation, but we are eliminating coal so rapidly that all base load except nuclear will soon be natural gas. Large-scale energy storage, either battery or other means, are many years away. Next slide. Okay, the transition from coal to natural gas is not just happening in Wisconsin, but nationwide. What happens when there is a major gas supply disruption or dramatic price increases? We are so convinced that cheap natural gas will last forever. Not only that, but ratepayers will be charged for converting from coal to natural gas, and then they will pay again to eliminate gas generation. Remember the target 2050 for complete decarbonization. Here's a little history. We Energies built the Elm Road Generating Station in Oak Creek in 2011. At the time, electric demand was increasing, so the plant was sized for a future that never developed. Demand fell before the plant was even completed. The PSC had approved every aspect of the project, so the ratepayers were on the hook for it. Now, before the plant has reached its expected design life, it is proposed to convert it to natural gas to meet short-term carbon reductions. Ratepayers again on the hook for a temporary fix. Instead, can we keep Elm Road, which is one of the most advanced coal plants in the nation, while we try to find viable means of carbon capture? Keep in mind that the long-range solution of nuclear and energy storage are very uncertain. Next. You're right if you interpret Wisconsin in the red area as a warning. Increasing energy demands and the rapid conversion of electric generation from fossil fuels to low carbon sources is reducing the reliability of the electric grid in Wisconsin. MISO is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. That's our red area that we fall in. They operate the dispatching of power from generators and the transmission grid in the states and provinces shown. Due to the rapid generation changes and need to upgrade transmission lines, they have now fallen into the high-risk category for reliability. There are a slew of transmission line improvements in process, but it's a challenge to connect all the new generation sources at the same time as making other necessary replacements and upgrades of transmission lines. Next. Wisconsin should have an integrated resource plan, an IRP, for electric generation and transmission. An IRP is a holistic approach to planning. The planning tool the Public Service Commission uses is called the Strategic Energy Assessment, but it is more of an information gathering tool. It is done by the PSC and is the source of most of the information used in this report. The problem is that the planning is done by the individual utilities. No one is really planning or choosing the direction for the overall good of the state. There is, for example, no advocate for a future for nuclear power in the state. For the past 5 years, next slide, please. For the past 5 years, the outage statistics have been trending in the wrong direction. This chart shows the industry standard measures of outage frequencies and durations. Rolling averages are used to remove the impact of single or seasonal storm events. So the trend is really concerning. The electric distribution system requires additional maintenance and hardening of the infrastructure to improve the reliability, especially because of increases in extreme weather events. Wisconsin has not adopted the most recent electrical code or raised standards for overhead lines. Also, tree trimming is the most impactful way to reduce outages in the short term. Next slide. This is my catch-all slide for miscellaneous topics that deserve mention. Adequate funding is less of a concern for energy than other infrastructure categories. Customer rates provide a reliable and adequate supply of funding. Unfortunately, the rates that customers pay climb year after year. Investors reward utilities that are granted rate increases. Why are utilities exceeding their carbon reduction targets? Is it because of deep commitment to reduce global warming? Or is it necessary to justify the increased customer rates, or both? We should not be surprised that utilities will fight tooth and nail for rate increases. That's how our system is set up. Utilities are justifiably concerned because they would be severely penalized by investors if their rates decreased. Here's a solution to the system that's not working for our benefit. Reward utilities with higher rates of return if they can control or lower customer rates. Now about cybersecurity. I get letters at least twice a year that a bank or insurance company has allowed my data to be compromised. Those responsible for our energy grid must ensure a much higher level of security and transparency. Utilities should receive the rate relief that they need for strong cybersecurity. Third-party cybersecurity vendors should be auditing or working to identify vulnerabilities. Utilities should inform the PSC about third-party vendors, including contract requirements and levels of service. What vulnerabilities were identified and fixed? All utilities need to benefit from the critical information on the attack environment. Utilities should be legally required to report successful cyber attacks, especially those that would involve ransoms. With transparency, the public can be given the assurance they deserve of robust cybersecurity of our energy infrastructure. We should recognize Next, we should recognize some of the good work of the Public Service Commission. Here are a couple programs that deserve recognition. Focus on Energy is one of the most successful conservation programs in the nation. PSC also has an Office of Energy Innovation, creating programs for things like grid resilience. Not only the PSC, but also Wisconsin utilities deserve high marks for their innovations in safety programs, customer systems, geographic information systems, uses of modern methods like LiDAR and drones, and many other advances. Next slide. So here's our summary of solutions that would help raise the grade for energy infrastructure in Wisconsin. Keep the Point Beach nuclear plant in service. Find some advocates to champion the use of new generation of nuclear power for Wisconsin. Slow down the elimination of coal generation until there can be more choice in base load power, such as clean coal, new nuclear, or energy storage. Use an integrated resource plan to improve reliability and control rate increases due to the transition to net zero greenhouse gas. We should explore rate making that rewards utilities for controlling or lowering customer rates. Next and final slide. Work to remove MISO from the high risk category of capacity and reliability. Address the decline in reliability by increased forestry work and hardening of infrastructure. Wisconsin needs to adopt the latest electrical codes. Finally, assure cybersecurity protections are robust and responsive to the changing threat environment. Increase transparency with the PSC and the public. And that's the conclusion of my report on the energy infrastructure category. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg, in absentia, for you going to the trouble to record your remarks so that we could have them here today. And you remind me of my comment in the introduction about that big old dead pine tree looming over the electric line that supplies my neighborhood. And Greg Schroeder, you provided a reality check on the source, the generation of the sources of energy production, on security concerns, on cost to ratepayers, on increasing frequency of outages, and the relatively tiny contribution of wind and solar to our current energy supply. So,
all right, I will grab my presentation here. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, let's get into full screen here. Okay, can you see my presentation? All right, excellent. Well, as I said, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Levesque, Vice President of Regional and Local Affairs at ATC. I've been with the company for 22 years, and I'm based in the Madison area. Just have a brief presentation for you today. I want to go through a couple of things happening in our industry and impacting my company. The first thing I want to do is a quick introduction to ATC. We are a Wisconsin-based company. We're actually based in Pewaukee. But as you can see from this map on the bottom right, we have offices in the Madison area, in Cottage Grove, in the Green Bay area, in De Pere, and then also in Kingsford, Michigan. We serve utility customers. What makes ATC unique is we do not serve end-use customers. We do not serve factories that are located here, businesses, homes. We actually serve utilities that provide that service. But we do provide that service to approximately a little over 5 million electric consumers. We have about 10,000 miles of lines and 580 substations in which equipment is located. We're in about 2/3 of the state of Wisconsin. In the bottom right, the green sections are ours. So you see the northwest portion, we just have a few lines, but we do not serve that area. We also serve the entire or most of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And then, as I like to say, we have a cup of coffee in Minnesota and Illinois with just a few assets there. What makes us unique is we're one of the only utilities in the company that has a sole focus on the high voltage electric grid or the transmission system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the electric system in a moment here. And then for more information on some of the work that we have going, we have the link here to our 10-year plan that looks out over the next 10 years and what we need to do. But I want to walk you through at a high level the electric system, bottom left here. There are the generation facilities, and those are making electrons. And the way I like to have people think about this is that those electrons, think of those as vehicles, as cars. And then those cars then need to get out and travel a long distance, and that's where the transmission system comes in, what my company does. Think of the transmission system as interstate highways or highways that take those electrons over long distances. And then the final component is the distribution system, which you can think of as the local roads, which drop the power off into businesses and homes. So that's an overview. But again, to be clear, my company solely focuses on that middle component of transmission. A little bit about what's happening in the transmission space right now. As I mentioned, my company plans, constructs, operates, and maintains high voltage facilities. And the one I cannot emphasize enough, there's the third one, the operation piece. Dorothy touched on this a little bit earlier. The electric system essentially keeps society moving. It keeps a peaceful society, keeps an orderly society. And quite frankly, it's something that I think all of us take for granted every morning when we flip the switch and the lights magically come on. But it's something we take very seriously, not only planning, constructing, and maintaining, but most importantly, operating the system. We have traditional drivers that are always driving our work. I mentioned maintenance. We have to rebuild facilities after they've been in service for several decades. But there really are three primary drivers happening right now in our industry. The first one is the energy transition. All of you have heard about this to some effect, but in large part, it is the move away from fossil fuel generation, think coal plants, and in some respects, gas plants, to renewable energy. Largely right now, you're talking about wind energy as well as solar energy. And the reason that is driving some of our work is because traditionally, when you have coal or gas facilities, they are located near a water source. In the state of Wisconsin, that's often near Lake Michigan or along rivers. But the new sources, we'll talk about solar and wind farms, those are often in more rural areas. So we need to build the facilities to go out to those generation facilities and move the power, as I said, over long distances. The other piece that's part of the energy transition is electrification. And everyone often thinks of electrification in the context of electric vehicles, but there's electrification happening in other areas, including in buildings. So that is driving some of the changes that we're seeing. The second piece is very good news, I believe. It's load growth is ramping up in Wisconsin, and what that means is we're seeing significant economic development, and that comes from businesses moving into Wisconsin. That comes from businesses like Kikkoman, who make soy sauce, staying in Wisconsin and reinvesting. But it also just means in general you're seeing economic development. But we need to meet those needs as more electrons need to be moved around the system. And then that final piece, cold weather events, and quite frankly, weather events in general. I guess I picked the perfect week to talk about that. Obviously, you all know what's happening in the southern part of the country. Everyone's seeing pictures of snow falling on beaches, but there are more cold weather events going on, not only in our footprint in the upper Midwest, but also all around the country. And the grid is interconnected, and that does impact the way that the system operates and the work that we have to do. So again, those are some of the primary drivers that we're seeing right now. I also want to talk a little bit about the fact that the electric grid, as I said, it's run in the upper Midwest, actually by one entity known as MISO, M-I-S-O. It's the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. And they are in charge of a couple of things. Number one, they need to make sure that the energy market is functioning efficiently, and it's really about producing those electrons and matching those electrons up with the load and the demand that's out there at any given time. They also help plan the transmission system in the upper Midwest. And part of that is making sure that you have those highways that I talked about to be able to reach the cheapest power at any given time and bring that into the state. Because it's not just about producing those electrons locally, it's really regional and making sure we have access to that. So the final slide I want to talk about is a little bit on MISO. A lot of words here, a lot of acronyms. Our industry is great with this, but MISO has what's known as LRTP Tranche 2. Those are long-range transmission plan projects that they have planned for the upper Midwest. They just approved these recently. This map I have up for you is a little busy, but you'll notice that Wisconsin is roughly in this area. These are all high voltage transmission projects that are going to be developed over the next 10 years. And what makes these unique is given the fact that we're part of this upper Midwest market, the costs are actually spread across the entire region. So they're shared equally across the region. And what I can share with you is these projects are not cheap. They're probably going to be in the $25 billion range. But as I mentioned, what makes them unique is the fact that they will give us access to cheaper power. And these projects had to go through a rigorous test that will show, or that showed, that over their life, and these projects last for decades and are in service for decades, they will pay for themselves over time. So you essentially have a cost that's spread out across the upper Midwest over several decades. But over time, you will eventually have these projects not only pay for themselves, but bring additional benefits by accessing the cheapest power that's out there. These will be very large projects. I mentioned there's a newer voltage class that's being introduced, and that is the green lines on this map. It's 765 kV, that's 765,000 volts. These are very large and high towers that also need a lot of right-of-way, essentially room to build those and to maintain the clearance from trees. But it's an attempt to have very efficient land use, because when you're up at a voltage this high, you're really going to not need a whole lot of other facilities moving forward to meet the electric needs. And finally, these projects are projected to be online within the next 7 to 10 years. So you'll see a lot of action with those. Now, what's interesting in Wisconsin is that some of those projects will be directly assigned to us, ATC, under MISO's tariff, which is federally approved. But some of those projects might be open to competitive bidding, and those are something that we'll be pursuing also. But again, these are kind of a high-level overview of some of the things you're going to see in the news and some of the development you'll be seeing not only within the state, but throughout the upper Midwest in the coming years. So that's all I had for today, and I think this will probably dovetail nicely into Dan Kreuger's presentation, which I believe is next.
Yeah, and Greg, thank you for explaining the critical transmission links in the energy supply chain. And I appreciate your analogy of the interstate highways system and local roads to understand the network. It also helps me understand all those various transmission lines that I see when I'm driving around the landscape. So thank you very much for being involved in building those and maintaining those, and for explaining it to us. So let's round off the discussion now with Dan Kreuger. Dan, you're on.
All right, thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Can everybody see that?
All good.
Got it.
All right, and you can hear me. Terrific. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I am Dan Kreuger, Executive Vice President of Infrastructure and Generation Planning for the WEC Energy Group. I probably should have had some slides with some background on the company, but suffice to say for today's presentation, WEC owns 7 utilities in 4 states, including We Energies and Wisconsin Public Service in Wisconsin. So most of my remarks today are going to be focused on We Energies. And I really appreciated the conversation and the presentations by Greg and Greg. I wish Greg was here because I would tell him that we're pretty aligned on most of his recommendations and we're working on all those things. But I'm going to give my comments here and there'll be some time for questions, I think, at the end. Let's see if I can advance this. Okay, here we go. Can you see that? Did the slide move?
Yes.
Okay. Similar to what Greg said, we do have 3 key drivers that impact our planning. So we have a planning group. While there's not an integrated resource plan currently within the state source plan, and across our 2 utilities of We Energies and WPS, that is the bulk of the state's electric and gas customers. We do also coordinate very closely with MG&E, and we also are in constant interaction with Alliance. So there's a lot of coordination and collaboration, thought sharing amongst the utilities. We do have the opportunity together with some tremendous economic development. It is primarily clustered along the I-94 corridor. I think people read a lot about the Microsofts of the world, but as Greg said, there's tremendous other development and growth going in, whether it's Eli Lilly with their tremendous pharmaceutical investment, Haribo, boat makers, you name it. It's really a credit to the people of Wisconsin and Southeast Wisconsin, how many companies want to come here. So our role as the utility is to keep pace with that growth. As long as we know what's expected and by when, generally speaking, we're able to work with ATC to get the transmission infrastructure in place to deliver power, and we're able to get the power plants built and the infrastructure built that will fuel them. So that's how we do it, as we keep pace. We are in the midst of the energy transition. We live here too. We are focused on the transition to reliably moving to lower rates of carbon, more zero carbon generation, and looking very hard at what is this changing mix of base load versus peak, and how do the plants that serve those, how is that changing right now? And I'll illustrate that shortly. And in terms of emissions targets, I wish we were exceeding our emission reduction goals. We're not. We're doing the best we can. We are down 54% in our carbon emissions since 2005. Our goal is to get to an 80% reduction by 2030. To us, that is a social and societal responsibility. And our view is that the reshaping of our generation portfolio will create a more affordable, more reliable, and cleaner set of power supply for all the people in Wisconsin. And lastly, we have to keep ahead of the evolving regional and federal rules. The reason for the coal plant closures is very simple. It's federal rules. There are rules around water discharge, rules around air discharge, all of which we have to keep pace with. They are extraordinarily expensive and complicated to comply with, even if we can. And we have recently taken steps to extend the life of at least one coal unit, recognizing, we're trying to balance all these different factors as best we can. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I'm showing this picture here. This illustrates a hypothetical week in May of, let's say, 2029. It's the end of this decade. So there's 7 days there, and you'll see 7 different peaks. The black line is what we expect our load to be. So it's all the demand from the homes, the factories, the schools, the hospitals, et cetera. That's the black line. And you see it moving across those 7 days. The sources of generation are remarkably different in this picture near 2030 than what they were 10 years and 20 years ago. The red is baseload nuclear. We are as interested as all the other parties in making sure that Point Beach continues to operate in Wisconsin. The dark blue is hydro. We do have a little bit of hydro. The gray is wind, and that's the combination of current and planned wind facilities in the state of Wisconsin. And the yellow is solar. So what I hope you see in this picture is that by around 2030, we're meeting most of that peak every day with this new core of zero carbon generation: nuclear, hydro, wind, solar. That is what is providing reliably your power. The times when we don't have enough from those sources, the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing, that's the orange. That's where this new generation of quick response, very flexible, modern gas-fired units comes in. They come online very quickly. They supply the power to fill the gap and make sure everything's running. And then they come off just as quickly when we no longer need it. So that's the gas generation for providing capacity and for energy balancing, as we call it. You might notice that in some of those days, fortunately in the models, solar actually exceeds the amount of power that we need, so it punches through there. The dotted line are hours where we seek to take that excess energy and use it to charge batteries. Then we discharge them in those green periods. And that's really important, sunset. So when the solar power produced is falling off faster than our load falls off, and it reduces the amount of gas that we need to use in those periods. Some other points that were made, those are very accurate. In 2005, almost 3/4 of our energy supply came from coal. By 2023, it was down to 32%. By 2030, we expect it to be down to less than 2%. And by 2030 is when some of these coal power related rules are proposed to take effect. One can really view these rules as what we call the end game. So between the water discharge rules and the emissions rules, it becomes highly uneconomic to run the coal plants for our customers. Carbon capture and sequestration is a great idea. However, in Wisconsin, we are not blessed with the geology, to store the carbon once we capture it. So what that would mean is we would have to put equipment on the plants, capture the carbon, put it into pipelines that are not yet built, run that carbon through these pipelines to storage fields, which may or may not exist, and then pay constantly for the transport and the storage of such carbon. The estimates of those costs are astronomical. In some states, it will work because they sit atop cavernous geology, and we wish them well. It won't work so well here in Wisconsin. And so when you look at 2030, we do see a significant portion of our energy being produced from nuclear and renewables, which is over 50%. We are planning to exit coal fully by 2032. And we do have the net carbon neutral goal, and I agree with Greg. We're not yet backing off that, and we think that is the best choice for our customers. And so just to wrap this up in my time, I do think Greg really set a good framework for this discussion. We do really agree on most of those points and those objectives. And we like to summarize our objectives as affordable, reliable, and clean. And by the way, our Wisconsin utilities are some of the most reliable utilities in the United States. And we're competing against the San Diegos, right? And the places that are much more moderate climates than we have. So to get those kind of rankings, I think something like 17 of the last 20 years, we've been best in the Midwest, and several times we've been the most reliable utilities in the United States. So our goals are to meet the load growth for Wisconsin of all kinds. We want to provide meaningful customer savings because these new plants that we're building will be much cheaper to own and operate than if we tried to keep these older coal plants running. Renewables are becoming the new core, and there's no fuel associated with that. We will have sufficient generation in place with gas to provide needed capacity, which means can the plants turn on and off when needed, and to provide those balancing hours when there's not enough generation from zero carbon. And we will put in firm gas supply. Greg started out with a picture of an LNG tank. Gas pipelines bring in gas from other parts of the country. That supply is firm until it's not firm, which has happened in the past. So we are building gas storage facilities at our sites to be used in peak conditions when the plants need it or the gas customers themselves need that gas. We'll liquefy it and we'll vaporize it in times of most need. And throughout all this, we're going to keep pace with all the evolving rules we get from state, regional, and federal entities. Those are my comments. Thank you very much.
All right, just had to let my dog in. He imposes time limits. And Dan, thank you so much. I captured the mutual goals in your words: affordable, reliable, and clean. And I hope we'll glean onto that. And you and the other knowledgeable representatives make clear the fact that the public and private sector are allies, and that everybody's effort is necessary in this regard. And your graphics were great to augment your words. We're working to supply the energy needs and the necessity of storage capabilities and the challenges of carbon capture. And all of your information is gold. We're lapping over into the intended Q&A, but I didn't want to cut it short. And these recordings will be available, and by all means, utilize them. But for now, Anastasia, you have the challenge of picking just a couple of key questions for our speakers, and we want to give them time to each give us one last takeaway point. So Anastasia, the challenge is yours.
You are on mute, Anastasia.
Thank you very much. It wouldn't be a webinar without at least a few technical issues. I'm just going to pin all of our speakers here so we can see them while they're answering the questions. The first one I wanted to ask, because I had seen multiple instances of this in the chat, is related to the new data centers that are being proposed and built in Wisconsin. We had quite a few questions about how that will impact the energy needs in Wisconsin, and what effect will that have on people's use of energy, the needs that Wisconsin uses, those sorts of questions. And that is for anyone.
Okay, I'll take a pass at that. This is Dan. The data centers are committed to paying for the cost of the infrastructure that is built to serve them. So when we look at these major data center sites, it's 3 steps. It's 1, how do we ensure that the power can actually be delivered to that site that we can basically plug in? And to do that, we work with ATC to look at substations and transmission lines and just make sure that the highways are there to deliver the energy and allow it to get to the site. Then the second thing is we have to have capacity machines to ensure that the data centers are not interrupted. Maybe that's a whole nother webinar, but there's different types of energy. And these data centers, in particular the AI centers, do not want to be interrupted. They are not interruptible customers. So we then pace them and we build a combination of all kinds of power plants to make sure that the power is there, to meet MISO requirements and to provide the energy that they're looking for around the clock. Then the third step is we work with them on how do we green it up. So all those things are in process. We are developing specific tariffs for what we call very large customers. So it's cleverly named VLC, the very large customer tariff. And again, the drivers of that are for those large data centers to come here and bring their growth and all the offshoots from it, to make sure that as they wish that they pay for the infrastructure that serves them and that other customers are protected.
Okay, any other comments on the data centers? There was a specific question about how that might impact the climate friendliness of Wisconsin's energy use, that sort of thing.
That goes to the third point. Each of the providers that we're talking to, starting with Microsoft, one of the reasons they came here, and you can see this on Microsoft's social media, is because of our 80% CO2 reduction goal, excuse me. And I have to tell you that I also head up our economic development function. It's remarkable how virtually every large customer that wants to come to Wisconsin is very focused on our environmental goals. To have environmental goals, the most important thing is we have to have the quick response gas plants. So the way that we get more renewables into our system is to make sure that we'll take all their power whenever the wind's blowing and the sun is shining, but we're there with these quick response linebackers, as we call them, to fill those gaps the minute that stops. As we go forward, again, we got to deliver the power to the site. We have to make sure we got power to serve them. And we expect to be working with those providers to make sure that the CO2 reduction goals from the state or for us are preserved.
Thank you. I want to do another energy question before we do a couple of broadband related questions. Greg and Dan, there were some questions about the reliability of our energy with the MISO vulnerabilities that were in the recorded presentation, that map that showed our region as being, you know, of the high risk vulnerability. And if you could comment on that and the capacity and reliability for our energy over the next 4 years.
Greg, how about I take a first crack and then you?
Makes sense.
Okay. The way, so MISO is the regional grid operator, and what they're trying to say there is they expect the utilities to have enough power plants that we can turn on and run at will, no matter what the weather conditions are every day. It's that simple. As the utilities in that red area that Greg pointed out have shut down older, less efficient coal and gas plants and oil plants and replaced them with wind and solar, certainly it's helping with CO2 and clean, but it does raise questions on, is there enough? MISO still has adequate reserves. They're just smaller than they used to be. So as part of that, at the WEC utilities, we are working, submitting to the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin requests to build enough of these quick start, very limited duty gas plants. So please keep in mind that when you retire a 1,000 megawatt coal plant and you replace it with a 1,000 megawatt gas plant, to MISO, well, that's the same. It's the same amount of capacity. But a coal plant runs 80% of the time. These new gas plants may run 10 or 20% of the time. And when they do run, it's half of the emissions rate on CO2. So that's our plan, is we're replacing these coal plants, these less efficient gas plants, with really modern ones. The same reliability, in my opinion, an even more reliable grid once we have these distributed plants built out there at a far lower carbon footprint. Greg, I invite you to add on to that.
Yeah, no, I think you did a good job of answering it. And again, my company does not own or develop generation. The only thing I'd add is that, MISO has numerous initiatives looking at this. And it's important to remember that when you look at MISO in the aggregate, that's several states in the upper Midwest, as well as down through Louisiana. And some states are in better shape than other states. And I think part of the red has to do with certain states, not Wisconsin, being in a more vulnerable position. That obviously affects the entire upper Midwest, but I do think that Wisconsin is doing the right things to address any of those concerns.
Thank you. We are at 1:30. I do want to get one broadband question in before we have everyone give their last pitches. If anyone needs to hop off, that's absolutely understandable. But again, these recordings will be available. Vik and Alyssa, I wanted to, someone in the chat would like to know, do you anticipate the bipartisan infrastructure law dollars will be available given the recent, change of administration in Washington?
I can defer to you, Alyssa. You may know more of what's going on. I think I saw that. I'm not sure where the funding stands, so.
The bipartisan infrastructure law is a law, so it was passed, signed, it's, and so to overturn a law takes quite a bit of, a full act of Congress. That said, a new administration means updated guidance. It means potentially changing rules. It means a different assistant secretary that might approve waivers. So I think it's expected that some of the guidance and the guardrails and the rules around the program will change as we administer it in a new administration, but it's not particularly expected that the funding related to the infrastructure law will be stopped or withdrawn. That said, Congress always, it's sort of their determination how they want to act, and there certainly have been laws, but it is part of a law. It is not part of an executive order. It wasn't directed by the president. It was a bipartisan law that was signed that we're administering through the BEAD program. So largely, I think the funding is still coming, but you can expect new guidance with the new administration and some potentially new rules.
I would add to what Alyssa said, and that's perfect. I think one other thing is, I think in the last couple months since the election, some money from the bipartisan infrastructure law was spending of it and approvals were accelerated. So the idea being that if somehow guidance changes how things are funded, having more money come out will ahead of time, that's now accounted for, will help alleviate the issues with that.
Very good to know as we, move forward in our advocacy efforts. Speaking of, I would like each of our wonderful speakers here to give us their last pitch. What would you like us to leave this webinar and go do, especially as we're communicating with our federal and state elected officials?
I guess I can start. I would say that we're in the budget season, and we have a goal that Alyssa's office has set for 2030, and I think it's a very worthwhile goal, and we need to make progress on that. And there are funding gaps, and so right now is as good a time as any to talk about the 2030 plan and ask your legislator to support putting more money in to achieve that.
Perfect. Thank you, Alyssa.
Thanks. I'll just make maybe the complimentary pitch that broadband access is critical. Maintaining a resilient, reliable, and ubiquitous infrastructure is important. But, keep thinking about affordability. We have to make sure that if we build this, that there's opportunities, and when people take public money, that they're able to make sure that it's affordable for everybody who's served, particularly when there's public dollars involved in part of the investment to make that infrastructure work for that business. Thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you for sharing that. Greg?
Okay, so my ask would be for everyone to just stay engaged and up to speed on issues that are going on in the electric industry. I can tell you, after several decades in this industry, it confounds me how controversial our industry can be when we are, as we laid out today, we perform an essential service for society, and we do impact people. We understand that. Obviously, there are always rate concerns. We impact people as far as where we site. But I do think it's important to remember that it is an essential service, and as I said earlier, something we all take for granted. And there are a lot of very good people working very hard to try to stay ahead of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dan, we'll wrap up with you.
Well, thank you for having us and for putting this event together. Dorothy, thank you for being the moderator. I think my key point is, as Dorothy said, we're all pretty well aligned when you stop and think about it. We all are trying to get to the same things. The more we talk and the more we understand each other's thoughts, I think the better off we all will be. I would just encourage you, if any of you want to talk to any of us, please feel free to reach out. And I'd like to see an all the above energy strategy. And I do think that broadband is a very important part of everything we do. And I will tell you, Alyssa, our power plants are very dependent on broadband, and so is this call. So I'd love to see broadband move out everywhere the same way that the rural electrification activities of the 1930s brought electricity to everyone in the country. So thank you.
Thank you all for these great messages. Dorothy, we're going to pass it back to you to have a wrap up for us and tell us about the next webinar.
All right. And thank you, speakers, for reminding us again that we're all in this together. And what can just a few people do? Well, remember, there are only 39 people signed the Constitution of the United States. and we've continued that, acting on that document pretty well with ups and downs. And we will continue in that vein. Thanks to everybody for attending. The excellent questions. There's a whole raft of questions that I couldn't get around to. But thanks to everyone behind the scenes at the State League, with the Wisconsin section of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the employers, the families. And a reminder that our next infrastructure report card webinar will be on hazardous and solid wastes, and will take place on February 6th, again in the noon to 1:30 p.m. time slot. Please join us again. And thanks to you all.